Hello folks, and welcome back to another Rank 'em All video. And today's video is going to be a special one, because we're going to rank Iron Maiden's full discography. And these guys are probably the biggest and most influential metal band of the 80s and beyond, besides perhaps Metallica. And they have so far released 17 studio albums, and their most recent album Senjutsu just came out a couple of days ago. So I thought it would make sense to rank all Iron Maiden albums here today, from the worst to the best. And this discography was real hard for me to rank, since I was more or less born and bred listening to Iron Maiden, like all metal fans more or less. Even if I don't consider myself to be one of the biggest Iron Maiden fans out there, I have listened to them on and off throughout the years. And I've also spent the last couple of weeks going back and listening to their catalog to make sure that I got the albums ranked in a proper way. So this is my personal rank of their catalog, and if you disagree with my choices, feel free to post your favorites down below. I'm always interested in hearing your opinions and feedback. And while you're at it, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you're new. Because now it's time to rank Iron Maiden's full discography, from the worst to the best. The worst Iron Maiden album is, in my opinion, The Final Frontier, and I don't think that I've listened to this album more than once back when it came out, but in the last couple of weeks I've listened to it a few times, and I was kinda curious to see what they did with the sci-fi theme on this record. But this album never really reaches the stratosphere for me personally. On the second half of the album, the band goes for a more epic sound with several songs that are 8 minutes or more, which is kind of the direction that the band has ventured towards on their last couple of records. This album is rather progressive and experimental, or maybe just long and boring depending on how you see things. And Bruce Dickinson also sounds a bit tired on this record, so I think it's one of his weaker vocal performances overall. The Final Frontier is not exactly a bad album though, but in comparison to the other Iron Maiden albums, I think this one is their weakest. So, next. In 16th place we have Virtual 11, and it kinda saddens me to put this album this low, since I listened to it quite a bit back in '98 when it came out. And it was Blaze Bayley that sung on this album, because he took over when Bruce Dickinson decided to go solo in the mid-90s. And I like Blaze Bayley. I think he's a great singer, which I think he proved with his solo band especially. But here it just sounds a bit weird. It's like Iron Maiden's music, and his vocals just didn't match that well. And Virtual 11 is for sure one of Iron Maiden's worst albums, but I think that it's better than a lot of the albums that other big metal bands put out during the same time period. I like the songs Future Real, The Clansman and Lightning Strikes Twice. And especially The Clansman, that song is actually great. But overall, this album is pretty weak, so next. In 15th place we have The Book of Souls from 2015. And it was 5 long years between The Final Frontier and The Book of Souls. And when this album finally came out, it was to no one's surprise a worldwide success, like more or less every Iron Maiden album are these days. And I really like the song Speed of Light, which they did a rather cool music video for. While not being an actual concept album, there are several references to the soul and mortality. Bruce Dickinson had cancer during this time, so the following tour was delayed, but it all worked out fine in the end. And the longest Iron Maiden song is actually featured on this album. It's called Empire of Clouds, and it's an 18-minute ballad with Bruce playing the piano. This album is also their longest, and it clocks in around 92 minutes, so this is a massive double album, and a pretty solid one, even if some songs stay beyond their welcome. So, next. In 14th place we have The X Factor from 1995. And this was the band's first release after Bruce Dickinson decided to leave the band to pursue his solo career. And in stepped Blaze Bayley, as I mentioned earlier. They only released 2 albums with him fronting the band, The X Factor in '95 and Virtual 11 in '98. I personally think that the X Factor is the better album out of those two, and the Blaze Bayley era of the band has been criticized for a long time, but I think it's a bit unfair, because the X Factor ain't a bad album in my opinion. But I think that most Maiden fans would probably never accept another singer than Bruce fronting the band, even if he wasn't their original vocalist. And for 1995, the X Factor was a pretty good album. Maiden, they stuck to their guns, and they didn't jump on the modern metal wave of the 90s, and they deserve some cred for that, so next. In 13th place we have the latest studio album Senjutsu that came out a couple of days ago. So this one is a bit hard for me to rank since it's brand new and all, but I have listened to it several times already, and I think it's an alright album. There are definitely a focus on the more progressive side of the band on this one. Lots of those 10-minute long Steve Harris epics here. And I think the album is a pretty good one, and I don't think it will disappoint that many fans, because this is kind of what I've expected from the band these days. And will it go down as one of Maiden's best albums? Probably not, but I think it serves its purpose. Stratego, Darkest Hour and The Parchment are amongst the better songs of the album, and Bruce still sounds good even though he is buried a bit deep in the mix sometimes. So, next. In 12th place we have Dance of Death from 2003. And this was the band's second album after Bruce Dickinson's comeback to the band in 1999. And the worst thing about this album is not the music but the cover art, and it's often voted as the worst album cover in metal. And who am I to disagree with that? It's just one of those Photoshop accidents. And this album was the follow-up to the rather successful Brave New World. And the Dance of Death is in a similar style. Maybe Dance of Death is a bit more mellow, and it doesn't reach the same heights as Brave New World. The production is great though, and it has this kind of bright feel to it. And the songs Rainmaker and Passchendaele are two cool tracks from Dance of Death that are worth checking out. So, next. In 11th place we have A Matter of Life and Death from 2006. And this was actually the first Iron Maiden album to reach the top 10 on the US Billboard's list. So this album did incredibly well. And A Matter of Life and Death had this kind of war and religion theme to it, which you can see on the artwork. This album is also a bit heavier than some of its predecessors, which I do like. And the production is great here, but some of the songs on this album are a bit too long and they overstay their welcome at times. I would like to see Iron Maiden throw in some quick rockers in between those long and epic songs, because it gets a bit rough when every song reaches the 8 to 9 minute mark, which is the direction we've seen from Iron Maiden ever since Bruce Dickinson rejoined the band. And these songs For the Greater Good of God, Different World and Reincarnation of Benjamin Brigg are three songs worth checking out from this album. And is this album a matter of life and death? Not really. For me this is more of an in-between album, so next. In 10th place we have No Prayer for the Dying from 1990. And this was the first album to feature guitarist Yannick Gers, whom replaced Adrian Smith. And this was the first lineup change in the band since 1982 when Bruce Dickinson joined the band. And No Prayer for the Dying received some negative reviews when it came out, and it was seen as not being as great as some of its predecessors. But what I do like about this album is that it's a nod to the band's early years. They kinda ditched the more progressive sound of their last two records, Somewhere in Time and Seventh Son of His Seventh Son, and they put out a more straightforward album, which was the reason behind Adrian Smith leaving the band, by the way. And there are some memorable tracks on this album like Tail Gunner, Holy Smoke and Bring Me Your Daughter to the Slaughter. No Prayer for the Dying might have been a slight disappointment at the time of its release, but it's far from a bad album, so next. In 9th place we have Brave New World from the year 2000s, and this was the big comeback album for Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith. Adrian Smith, who once was replaced by Yannick Gers, was back in the band, But they didn't kick out any members, instead they had 3 guitarists on this album. Brave New World was a huge album, but it was also an immensely important album. Not only for Iron Maiden, but for the whole heavy metal revival that happened in the early 2000s. The 80s surely belonged to Iron Maiden, but the band had a much rougher time during the 90s. Their previous 2 albums, The X Factor and Virtual 11, was far from fan favorites. So it was cool to see the band get their shit together again and bring back Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith, and do another album that the fans and critics responded well to. And Brave New World wasn't just nostalgia for old Iron Maiden fans. There are some pretty wicked songs on this album, like The Wicker Man, Blood Brothers and The Mercenary. So, next. In 8th place we have Fear of the Dark, and this album came out in 1992. And this was the band's last album to feature Bruce Dickinson before he left to pursue his solo career. And this album was released in 92 when this type of metal wasn't exactly the hot new thing. But I respect the band for standing their ground and doing what they do best. The reviews for this album was a bit all over the place, but I really don't understand why. I think Fear of the Dark is a great album. I mean, several of the songs on this album are still staples in their live shows. Like Be Quick or Be Dead, From Here to Eternity, Afraid to Shoot Strangers, and of course the title track Fear of the Dark. And let's not forget about the song Judas Be My Guide. That one has this kind of early Queensryche feel to it. And this album was the last Iron Maiden album to be produced by Martin Birch. And the work that he did for this band and many others was nothing but excellent. And I think that most fans can agree with me when I say that Fear of the Dark is without a doubt the best Iron Maiden album of the 90s. So, next. In 7th place I put Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. And this album came out back in 1988. And I think it was their peak of their progressive explorations. And this is a concept album inspired by the book Seventh Son. And this album stands out a bit in their discography, not only for the use of synthesizers and being a concept album, but also I think it's their most 80s sounding record. There's a lot of big melody lines and the production has an airiness to it. It's also the least aggressive Iron Maiden album of this era. Bruce Dickinson was more involved in the songwriting on this album compared to Somewhere in Time. And this was also the last Iron Maiden album with Adrian Smith for 12 long years. The songwriting on this album is obviously great. There are many classic Iron Maiden songs on this album. Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, Moonchild, Can I Play With Madness, The Evil That Men Do, and The Clairvoyant, to name a few. And this is a great album without any fillers, and it's definitely an album that you should be familiar with if you like some melody and progressive riffing. So, next. In 6th place we have The Number of the Beast from 1982, and this was the band's first album with Bruce Dickinson, and it was also their big breakthrough album. 3 of their biggest hits was on this record: The Number of the Beast, Run to the Hills and Hallowed Be Thy Name. And add to that songs like Invaders, Gangland and 22 Acacia Avenue. This is just a classic album and possibly one of the most important albums in the band's career. For me it's kinda hard to rank an album like this. It's obviously great and a full-fledged classic, but some of the songs are a bit overplayed. And I can't say that I enjoy listening to Run to the Hills and The Number of the Beast no more, since I've heard those songs more or less weekly ever since I was a kid. So I'll just leave this album by stating that it's one of the most legendary albums of all time. So, next. In 5th place we have Peace of Mind from 1983. And this was the first album to feature drummer Nico McBrain, who has been with the band ever since. And the second studio album with Bruce Dickinson. And this is without a doubt one of Iron Maiden's absolute best albums, even if a lot of the songs from this album has been ignored during the band's live performances. I mean, Where Eagles Stare, Flight of Icarus, To Tame a Land, and of course the mighty The Trooper, which is not only one of the band's biggest hits, but it's also one of the best songs that they ever wrote. And there is no synthesizers or ulterior motives here. So, next. In 4th place we have Killers from 1981, and this was Iron Maiden's second studio album, and the last with Paul Di'Anno. The Paul Di'Anno era had a more of a punkish sound to it than the Dickinson era that followed. I personally prefer the Paul Di'Anno era, even if those two albums have a few songs on them that just sound so dated and simplistic. And Killers has some killer tracks on it, like Wrathchild, Murders in the Rue Morgue, and the instrumental beast Genghis Khan, which I think is one of the best instrumentals that I've ever heard. Early Iron Maiden is really at their best in those faster songs. Purgatory is another one of those fast and superb songs that are worth mentioning here. And I think it was a bold move to kick out Paul Di'Anno, since I thought his vocal style really fitted what the band was doing on those first 2 records. But apparently the band wanted a more melodic singer that could hit those high notes. Killers is a classic Iron Maiden album that all hard rock and heavy metal fans should be familiar with, so next. In 3rd place we have Iron Maiden's 1980 self-titled debut album, and it's the only album to feature guitarist Dennis Stratton. And it was indeed a magnificent debut. Prowler, Phantom of the Opera, Transylvania and Iron Maiden might all be in my top 10 Iron Maiden songs of all time. Just remarkable stuff for being released as early as in 1980. They really took metal to a new level with those early 1980s releases. The song Running Free seems a bit dated and simplistic, but otherwise the album is great, and it's perhaps the coolest and best album to come out of the new wave of British heavy metal era. It's one of the most iconic metal albums of the decade, and it's for a good reason, because Iron Maiden's debut was excellent. So, next. In 2nd place we have Powerslave from 1984, and this was their 5th studio album, and besides having the coolest artwork, I also hold it as one of their strongest albums. It kicks off with Aces High, and it ends on Rime of the Ancient Mariner. 2 stunningly great tracks. And the later being one of Iron Maiden's longest songs for some 30 years, and it's almost 14 minutes long. 2 Minutes to Midnight is another classic Iron Maiden track, and Lucifer's Words and Flash of the Blade are pretty decent too. And let's not forget about the title track here, Powerslave, with those Egyptian sounding riffs. Powerslave is just a great album with lots of galloping guitars, and I love galloping guitars, so this is one of Iron Maiden's absolute finest moments. So, next. The greatest Iron Maiden album is in my opinion Somewhere in Time from 1986, and this was the first Iron Maiden album to feature guitar synthesizers. And the band toured extensively before entering the studio to record this album, so there were some conflict about what direction that the band was going in. Bruce Dickinson had written some acoustic-oriented songs that the rest of the band refused, so Bruce ended up without any songwriting credits on this album. And even if the band refused to go full acoustic on this album, it was a slight change in direction for the band, with the addition of synthesizers. But they also had a more progressive sound on this record, a sound that would be fully realized on their next album, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. And usually I like the more straightforward stuff, but Somewhere in Time is a superb album, and it doesn't really have any fillers on it like some of the other albums. This one is enjoyable the whole way through, and it might not be the heaviest Iron Maiden album, but I think that Somewhere in Time will be remembered as one of their best. It just has an overall great standard, because more or less every song on this record is great. Wasted Years, Heaven Can Wait, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, Stranger in a Strange Land, and Alexander the Great, to name a few. Maybe some of their biggest hits wasn't on this record, but I think that the standard that they set here was their highest, so that's why I hold Somewhere in Time as Iron Maiden's best album. And now it's time to check out my full list, so here we have it, 17 studio albums in total. So this was a lengthy episode of Rank 'Em All, but Iron Maiden is such a legendary band that we had to do them sooner or later. But now I'm curious to hear about your opinions on their discography. what's your favorite Iron Maiden album? And if you're familiar with their full discography, feel free to post your ranking of their albums down below. It's always cool to see if you guys agree with my list or not. And if you enjoyed this video, then make sure to leave a like so that this video can be recommended to other Maiden fans. And subscribe to the channel if you're new. And if you enjoy my work and want to support my channel, then you can drop me a few dollars on Patreon like these absolute sirs. Or go and grab yourself a shirt at the Ruthless metal store. And join my community over on Discord, there is always a lot of discussions going on there. And I'm also on Spotify and Facebook, and you can find all my links listed down in the description below. And let me know whose discography I should take on in the next episode of Rank 'Em All. And that's all folks, thanks for watching and up the irons, bye bye.